I suppose to some extent it makes sense that we measure the power of an engine, especially a car engine, in horsepower. I mean, after all, before cars and tractors and trains, horses were our primary vehicle. We used them to plow the soil, to move cargo, to travel distances. But how much power really is horsepower? Wouldn't that depend upon which horse? And how is it that horsepower came to be one of the most common ways that we measure the power of a car engine? Well, actually, the history of horsepower goes back to the 18th century, and a man whose name is virtually synonymous with measuring power, James Watt. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The first commercial steam-powered device is generally considered to be Thomas Savery's steam pump, which he invented in 1698. In 1702, Savery wrote that an engine which will raise as much water as two horses working together at one time in such a work can do. By 1712, Thomas Newcomen had created a steam engine that could transmit continuous power. Both of these early designs were primarily used to pump water from mines. The Newcomen engine was significantly more powerful and replaced a team of 500 horses that had been used to pump water out of a mine. It would take decades, however, for these machines to be considerably improved. In 1759, the Newcomen engine came to the attention of James Watt, a Scottish inventor and mechanical engineer who had made a living fixing and making scientific and musical instruments in Glasgow, Scotland. Watt was born in 1736, and though sickly as a child, showed an aptitude for math. He learned to repair and make instruments like sextants, compasses, and barometers. He found employment at the University of Glasgow. He also started a business building musical instruments and toys. There is a popular story that Watt was inspired to investigate steam after seeing a kettle boil and steam lift the kettle's lid. The story has been told in a variety of forms, none of which are probably strictly true. Still, while he was not inspired by a boiling kettle, he did conduct many laboratory experiments that did include the use of a kettle to create steam. Watt came to understand the rules of thermodynamics, a field that would not be formalized for another century. A friend seems to have brought the steam engine to his attention when he suggested that a steam engine could be used to drive a wagon, replacing horses. It was in repairing a University of Glasgow model Newcomen engine in 1763 or 1764, however, that it came upon a better system that could significantly increase the engine's efficiency. The Newcomen engine had a single piston that was alternatively heated and then cooled, which wasted a significant portion of the machine's potential. His innovation was to add a separate chamber he called a condenser, in which steam could condense, which massively improved efficiency. Later, he was also able to make another significant innovation by using a sun and planet gear system to allow his engines to make rotary motions, allowing steam engines to spin wheels. Despite his talent for inventing, it took him years to realize any financial gain from his work. His research left him in near poverty, and he spent years in the 1760s borrowing money and working as a civil engineer. At one point, he so despaired of success that he wrote, "Of all things in life, there is nothing more foolish than inventing," and probably the majority of inventors have been led to the same opinion by their own experiences. By 1768, he had created working models, and in 1769 he received a patent for a new invented method of lessening the consumption of steam and fuel in fire engines. Also, in 1768, he met with Matthew Boulton, owner of a manufacturing company and leader in the English Enlightenment movement. Boulton had had little formal schooling, but he had become successful as a businessman and scientist anyway, corresponding with Benjamin Franklin and Charles Darwin's grandfather. He bought an interest in the patent, and Watt continued his work. Watt was able to introduce his engines commercially in 1776 and agreed to be paid for the machines by taking royalties on 1/3 of customer savings compared to coal cost of running the Newcomen engines. While this was a profitable system, it didn't work with customers who did not already have steam engines and who used horses instead. Horses were widely used for all kinds of power in the 18th century and earlier, not just for plowing fields and pulling wagons. Mills, where grain is ground into flour, were important to create bread, a staple food for European society, as well as in creating malt powder for use in brewing. Wind, water, and ocean have all been used to turn mills and grind grain, but the most effective means of running a mill by the late 18th century was the horse. Samuel Whitbread ran a successful brewery in London and had 6 horses that walked ceaselessly in circles to power the mill. He may have had as many as 20 horses for the mill, which were switched out to keep the mill working at peak efficiency. It isn't 100% clear how Watt eventually came up with the number that would define horsepower. In one version, Watt, watching horses like Whitbread's, observed them to complete about 144 circuits in an hour, about 2.4 times a minute. He determined that the horses pushed the shafts of the mill with a force of about 180 pounds. Using a complicated formula, he determined that a horse could produce 32,572 foot-pounds a minute, where a foot-pound is the amount of force it takes to raise a pound a foot in the air. Others had come up with different numbers, but Watt standardized his version of horsepower at 33,000 foot-pounds per minute. That might sound like complete nonsense, but it can be visualized. Imagine a single horse raising a 33-pound bucket from the bottom of a 1,000-foot deep well in 1 minute. The energy it takes to raise that bucket is 1 horsepower. One version attributes his calculations to watching the work of pit ponies, which worked to raise coal from mines. He guessed they could lift an average of 220-pound force 100 feet a minute, and he estimated that a full horse would be at least 50% stronger, coming up with a number similar to the 33,572 foot-pounds in a minute of the earlier tale, which was then standardized at 33,000 foot-pounds per minute. Watt may have done both estimations before standardizing the measure, but however he came up with it, his estimation was a tour de force of marketing. A popular legend for how he came up with this number is that he was challenged by a brewer to build a steam engine that could match the work of a horse. The brewer established the amount by putting his strongest horse to work for 8 hours, driving him all the time to the limit of his endurance. Popular Mechanics in 1912 said the 30,000 foot-pounds, that is the amount of force necessary to lift a 30,000-pound weight 1 foot in 1 minute, produced by the horse, exceeds by nearly 1/3 the work capacity of an average horse. But Watt made his engine produce at least 33,000 foot-pounds and dubbed the value a horsepower. This story is likely apocryphal, but it does fairly accurately represent Watt's marketing strategy. He told Whitbread that his engines could harness the power of 200 horses at once without having to store or feed the animals. Whitbread took the bait, and within a year it increased production from 90,000 barrels to 143,000. The replacement of horses and mills with steam engines was a turning point in the Industrial Revolution. Earlier steam engines like Newcomer's pump were limited in where and how they could be produced, but Watt's engines could be used nearly anywhere, thus providing an immense source of power to countless industries and massively increasing human production. The engine installed in Whitbread's brewery on Chiswell Street was installed in 1785, only the second steam engine installed in a brewery. It could produce around 35 horsepower, and it helped Whitbread become the largest brewer in the country. In addition to Watt's success in naming the horsepower, King George III and Queen Charlotte visited the brewery and the machine on May 24, 1887. Astoundingly, that steam engine still exists, even though it's moved far from its original home. It was only actually decommissioned in 1887, 102 years after its installation. Archibald Liversidge, an English chemist and a trustee at what was then called the Technological, Industrial and Sanitary Museum in Sydney, Australia, intervened before the engine could be scrapped and had it donated to the museum. The museum, which is now called the Powerhouse Museum, still displays the engine. It is the oldest surviving rotative steam engine still in existence. Watt's steam engine and his work with Bolton catapulted him into an internationally famed inventor. His patent made him a wealthy man and allowed him to play a significant part in England's technological revolution. He created a number of other inventions, including a portable copying machine. In the 1790s, some of his clients stopped paying him as other separate condenser steam engines came to market, and they thought that his patent would be impossible to defend, so he spent considerable time in court fighting other inventions. He retired in 1800, built a magnificent house he called the Heathfield, and spent the last years of his life tinkering with inventions like a machine for copying sculptures and traveling the world. He died on August 25, 1819. His inventions and improvements on the steam engine were epoch-changing, providing a significant foundation for further inventions, and he has a claim to being one of the fathers of the industrial age, as his work helped power many of the innovations that transformed the world over the 19th century. In 1882, Charles William Siemens first suggested using the name watt to apply to a unit of power. It's now familiar to many as the output of a very different invention, the light bulb. Despite his somewhat imprecise measurement of horsepower, the term caught on, becoming a standard way of talking about the output of power of engines throughout the 19th century. There are actually differing measurements for a horsepower as well. A mechanical horsepower is the number familiar to many in the US and elsewhere. It uses the standard measurement and the output and performance of vehicle engines. But there's also a metric horsepower which differs slightly. While mechanical horsepower is the equivalent to about 745 watts, a metric horsepower is equal to about 735. Of course, now we are pretty far removed from a time when a horse was the most recognizable symbol of working power. But we can be reminded of those early days every time we work with something that has an engine, from cars to lawnmowers. James Watt had an enormous impact on the world when he developed his engine, and that impact would have been important even if he'd never come up with the stroke of marketing genius of that term, horsepower. And yet, come up with that stroke of genius, he did. The term became so standard that the very first advertisement for a Model T boasted that the car has 20 horsepower. It's also interesting to note that while the number of horsepower given for most vehicles reflects peak horsepower, most horses can produce much more than 1 horsepower for brief periods. A 1993 study, based on measurements made in 1926, found that the horse's peak power reached as high as 14.9 horsepower, but that for sustained activity, a rate of about 1 horsepower fits with how 18th and 19th century people used horses. For James Watt, the engine that he built and the term that he coined created a legacy that lasted far beyond his lifespan and is still visible today. All you have to do to see it is to, well, pop the hood. His statue in Westminster Abbey has an epitaph which says that Watt enlarged the resources of his country, increased the power of man, and rose to an eminent spot among the most illustrious followers of science and real benefactors of the world. The word plastic is derived from the Greek word for to form or shape. And the term really predates the stuff that we call modern plastics. It's been used as early as the 16th century to refer to any compound that was, say, moldable or shapeable. But it is a particularly apt term for modern plastics, which can apparently be shaped into almost anything, and because of that have been shaped into, well, almost everything. We have a very mixed relationship with plastic. The term itself has come to mean fake or cheap, and plastic trash in the environment has become an issue of international concern. But plastic is so related to our modern life, so pervasive, that plastic is practically the definition of modernity. And that material, which can be shaped into almost everything, has shaped us as well, almost from the very beginning. The story of celluloid, the first man-made plastic, is history that deserves to be remembered. Plasticity is a general property of materials that refers to the ability of that material to undergo deformation without breaking. Soil has plasticity, that's why you can leave a footprint. Metal has plasticity, that's why it can be bent. The materials we call plastics have such high plasticity, ability to form them into new shapes, that they become named after the ability. Plastic is moldable polymer. While we think of plastic as the epitome of fake and not naturally derived, the building blocks of plastic are not just rooted in nature, they are fundamental to it. Polymers are so-called macromolecules, very large molecules made up of repeating chains of smaller molecules. The smaller molecules, called monomers, join together in a process called polymerization to create three-dimensional structures that can include thousands of molecules, for example, proteins. Typically, though not exclusively, the backbone of polymers will be carbon, which is strong and stable and well suited to forming molecular bonds. Today we create many forms of artificial polymers, but natural polymers, biopolymers, are central to life itself. Polynucleotides are polymers. That's that stuff that we call DNA. These large molecular masses, and by that I mean compared to smaller molecular compounds, but we are still talking about molecules here, exhibit certain characteristics. They tend to be tough, that is, they have an ability to absorb energy by plastically deforming rather than fracturing. They tend to form glass or semicrystalline structures rather than crystals. They tend towards viscoelasticity, which is that they show characteristics of both viscosity and elasticity, or roughly the ability to deform under pressure and yet return to an original form. To get the idea, natural rubber is a biopolymer, as are natural gums like chicle. So are wool, silk, and resins like amber and shellac. All of these biopolymers exhibit some characteristics of the stuff that we today call plastic. Humans have been using biopolymers in their natural form for a very long time. There's evidence that people have been chewing gum made of tree resin since the Stone Age. Mesoamericans were using natural tree rubber to make balls at least since the 2nd millennium BC. A process for making silk textiles was developed in China in the 4th millennium BC, and wool textiles date back to at least 1500 BC. There's written evidence of the use of shellac, a natural resin secreted by a bug that can be dissolved into liquid, reshaped and hardened again in the 1st millennium BC. The most abundant biopolymer on Earth is cellulose, which is the stuff that forms the cell walls in plants. Cellulose is what allows wood to be strong. It's what allows paper, which is mostly made out of cellulose, to be flexible. It's what allows wool to be spun into textiles. Wood is about 40 to 50% cellulose, but the purest natural form of cellulose is cotton, which is 90% cellulose. Cellulose was also the foundation of the first man-made plastic. In the 1830s, it had been discovered that cellulose could be nitrated, that is, have a chemical nitro group introduced into the compound. This was generally done by mixing cellulose with nitric acid. The resulting compound, nitrocellulose, was highly combustible. Its first use was as an explosive, commonly called gun cotton. Gun cotton can be very volatile, and the first attempts to manufacture it were abandoned because the factories tended to, well, blow up. Well, gun cotton itself has an interesting history. A prolific inventor from Birmingham named Alexander Parks found a unique use for it. Parks essentially took gun cotton and dissolved it in various solvents and found out that it turned into sort of a viscous substance that could then be poured into a mold. And his first thought was to use that to make waterproof cloth, but it turns out that the compound, which he called parksine, could really be molded into almost anything. Parks took out his first related patent in 1855. He later won a bronze medal for excellence of product in the International Exhibition in London in 1862, exhibiting things like buttons, handles for knives and razors, and decorative cases for daguerreotypes. Parksine is generally recognized as the first man-made plastic. But parksine didn't quite change the world. Parks tried to commercialize his product and formed a company in 1866. But the problem was that Parks wanted to keep the price very low. That was the idea. Parksine could be used as a substitute for all manner of natural materials, but its advantage was that it would be cheap to produce. But in trying to keep it cheap, he used substandard materials, was not able to manufacture items of the same quality produced for the Crystal Palace exposition. Parksine turned out to be prone to cracking and highly flammable. His company folded in 1868. What took Parks' invention to the next step was a shortage. The game of billiards likely derived from various lawn sports, and French King Louis XI had the first known indoor billiard table made in the 15th century. The sport became popular among the wealthy, and into the 18th century it had become more common in places like Paris cafes. The balls could be made of wood or clay, but the wealthy preferred ivory. The game had grown in popularity, and by the middle 19th century was popular enough in the United States, at least virtually every estate or mansion was expected to have a billiards table, that there was a growing concern about the cost and availability of ivory to meet the demand for billiard balls. A New York Times article in 1867 worried that 3,500 pachyderms had been sold from the island of Ceylon in just 3 years to make billiard balls. The paper worried that the supply of animals might eventually be used up. The first great billiard star in the United States was Michael Phelan. Known as the most scientific and expert player in the nation, Phelan worked to standardize the U.S. billiards table, became involved in manufacturing billiard supplies. In 1863, Phelan's company, Phelan and Collender, offered a substantive prize of $10,000 for the first person who could develop an adequate substitute for ivory in the making of billiard balls. The prize was never apparently awarded, but it inspired an American inventor named John Wesley Hyatt. In brief, after experimenting, Hyatt figured out that using the chemical camphor, a turpentine chemical derived from an evergreen tree, as a solvent caused a plasticizing effect on parksine. By removing volatile substances from the parksine mixture, he removed the shrinking and warping caused by having to dry those solvents out. While Park had used camphor, he apparently saw it as just another solvent and did not realize its potential. Hyatt called his compound celluloid. The great advantage of celluloid was that it was the first true thermoplastic. By making parksine less volatile, Hyatt created a compound that could be heated and shaped. Patented in 1869, celluloid could be produced cheaply to make a wide range of things. In fact, almost anything, including, of course, billiard balls. Hyatt created the Albany Billiard Ball Company, and his celluloid composite balls dominated the industry until the 1960s, although there is no evidence that he ever collected on Phelan's prize. In 1870, Hyatt formed the Albany Dental Plate Company, which creates not just dentures made out of celluloid, but also piano keys. The Dental Plate Company became the Celluloid Manufacturing Company in 1872. Hyatt developed more processes and products. Because celluloid could be easily dyed and colored, it could be used as an alternative for a number of products that could be only derived from nature, thus limiting their mass availability. Things like tortoiseshell, marble, mother of pearl, coral, lapis lazuli, and even wood textures and grains could be reproduced in celluloid. It could so replicate the look of ivory that it was often marketed under the name French ivory. It was used in decorative items like mirror cases and on knife handles. It was used to decorate the fronts of accordions, guitars. Hyatt developed a process called blow molding, which allowed celluloid to be used to make dolls, despite being still relatively flammable. Celluloid dolls are expensive collector items today. If all this seems like knickknacks, it was in reality the growth of the middle class. Plastic made consumer items affordable and available to masses of people looking to enjoy the trappings of new wealth, and in doing so, possibly saved animals like elephants used for ivory and tortoises used for combs from extinction. To show the meaning, mantle clocks were once an important sign of wealth, covered in the rarest and most expensive materials. Using celluloid veneers, fancy mantle clocks could be made to look like the rarest wood grains, covered with the most desired precious and semi-precious materials. Like the dolls, those clocks today are valuable collector pieces. In its day, it meant millions more could enjoy the trappings of prosperity. A surprising example is in clothing. In the latter half of the 19th century, more people were moving from factories and farms to work in offices and stores. Now people had to dress professionally. But it was expensive to keep things like collars and cuffs stiff and clean. Hyatt earned at least 11 different patents for celluloid clothing, using detachable shirt cuffs and collars. Sometimes using a celluloid veneer over white paper, the cuffs and collars would remain stiff, could be cleaned with water. Thus, in rapidly changing times and the development of a new middle class, celluloid literally represented the shift from blue-collar to white-collar work. But by far its most important impact on culture came via another medium. Celluloid and photography were already cousins. Potassium iodide added to liquid gun cotton produced a light-sensitive material that was used to make the first photonegatives on glass plates. That process allowed the reproduction of photos and quickly replaced daguerreotypes. But the next step used celluloid directly, as celluloid's qualities, it was naturally transparent, flexible, and could be very thin, made it the perfect medium to replace the glass and create photographic film. American inventor Hannibal Goodwin patented a process to produce a celluloid film base to be used in Thomas Edison's kinetograph. At the same time, George Eastman developed a practical roll film to be used in personal cameras, creating the Eastman Kodak Company. Goodwin and Eastman would sue each other over patents, but celluloid had allowed both affordable personal photography and practical motion pictures. Both transformed culture in profound ways. As an odd demonstration of the power of celluloid, in the 19-teens, early film star Irene Castle became so popular on film that her hairstyle, the short bob, became so popular that it caused a collapse in the market for one of celluloid's most popular products, the personal comb. Facing a reduced market, one manufacturer of celluloid women's hair products shifted to a new line. Using the newly developed process of injection molding, Sam Foster started producing celluloid sunglasses, first from a Woolworth store on the boardwalk in Atlantic City under the brand name Foster Grant. The popularity of celluloid film drove the development of inexpensive celluloid sunglasses, which were largely featuring movie stars in their marketing. The relationship between humanity and plastic is something that author Susan Frankel describes as a toxic love affair. Celluloid, it created this revolution that it led to the development of all sorts of different kinds of plastics to make virtually everything. And it's not just consumer items that we get from plastic. It led to huge advancements in science and technology. I mean, could we have ever gone to the moon? Could we go to outer space if we didn't have plastic? And it allowed us to stop taking the things we need just directly from nature. I mean, elephants might be extinct today if it weren't for John Wesley Hyatt. But some of the very characteristics of plastic that made it popular, its durability, its longevity, its water impermeability, have now created environmental crises of their own. As much as 12.5 million tons of plastic enter the oceans each year, threatening the entire ecosystem. It takes an estimated 500 years for a plastic diaper to decompose. New research is focusing on biodegradable plastics and the use of microbial species that can dispose of plastic waste, as well as more focus on recycling and eliminating the use of single-use plastics. The age of celluloid is really over. Pretty much everything that used to be made out of celluloid has been replaced by some newer, all man-made plastic that's more stable. Celluloid film always had its risks because it degrades over time and it's very flammable, and so millions of feet of old films rotted away, degraded in their canisters, or burned up in vault fires. Even caused some fires in hospitals because of the film that was used for x-rays. Nitrate film was slowly replaced with acetate film, which was less flammable, more stable, but even all that's being replaced by digital processes today. One of the last great niches for celluloid was ping pong balls. It seemed to have that perfect bounce, but even that era has now come to an end. As of July 1st, 2019, the International Table Tennis Federation gave up the celluloid balls in exchange for polyballs, balls made out of all man-made polymers. You can still find cellulose ping pong balls on the market for traditionalists. Sometimes celluloid is used to make guitar picks, but for the most part, the compound that led us into the future has been relegated to the past. Earlier in the year, there was a sudden demand for cloth face masks that far exceeded the supply, and that led to something of a revival for a household machine that had followed largely into disuse, the household sewing machine. Suddenly the grandmother that made beautiful quilts or the mother that wanted to make a beautiful Easter dress were doling out cloth masks to the family left and right. And prior to the Industrial Revolution, that task would have been much more laborious. Sewing and mending clothes was a household task that took several days out of every month, and store-bought clothing was a luxury item that could be rather expensive. But during the Industrial Revolution, several entrepreneurial men sought to reduce the burden of sewing by creating mechanical sewing machines. Sewing machines are more than a hobby item for quilt makers. They transformed economies, changed women's roles in the workplace. They transformed massively culture and became the backbone of multiple industries, including the garment industry, which is today a $368 billion annual industry in the United States. The invention of the mechanical sewing machine is history that deserves to be remembered. Sewing is the act of connecting fabric via needle and thread. The earliest needles were made of wood, bone, or ivory, with estimates that the first needles were used between 30 and 60,000 years ago. The oldest was found in Denisova Cave, a prehistoric early hominid dwelling in Siberia that contained a 7-centimeter needle made of bird bone that is approximately 50,000 years old and yet described as still usable. These needles would have been used with plant fibers or animal sinew to piece together hides or skins of animals for clothing or shelter. In Egypt, copper needles were found dating back to around 4000 BC, and iron needles have been found in Bavaria from the 3rd century BC. Needles are such a valuable tool that they are celebrated in Japan in Harikuyo, the Buddhist and Shinto festival. In this festival of the broken needles, the sewing tools that were broken over the past year are thanked for their service. Prayers are offered up for improved skills for the tailors and seamstresses. But why needles have been a tool for humankind for millennia, a machine that can replicate the human motion of the needle, is a relatively new invention. The first design for a sewing machine is generally accepted to be in 1790, when Thomas Saint, a cabinet maker in England, designed and detailed a machine intended for use on leather and canvas. The machine used a chain stitch in which a series of loop stitches form a chain-like pattern. The process uses 2 points, a stitching awl that pierces the material, and a forked point rod that would carry the thread through the hole where it was hooked underneath. But Saint never appeared to market his design. It was never produced or used in any large numbers. It's assumed that he probably had at least one working device, but no original examples exist. But in 1874, an engineer was able to replicate the design using those original patent drawings. While several machines were patented in the early part of the 19th century, either the designs failed or were not successfully marketed. Joseph Mattersberger, an Austrian tailor, was granted a patent in 1814 for a machine that he created to recreate the motions of the human hand while sewing. He never marketed the design, and the patent expired 3 years later. He died in the poorhouse in Vienna, never having had any success. The first practical machine to see wide-scale use was created in 1829 by a tailor named Bartholomew Timonier, who recruited Auguste Ferrand, an engineer, to help with patent drawings. Their patent was granted by the French government in July of 1830. Timonier successfully negotiated a contract with France for the manufacture of army uniforms and opened the first machine-based sewing factory with 80 machines. However, his factory was burned in an act of arson, allegedly by a group of tailors who feared their jobs would be replaced by the invention. Timonier was inside when the fire began, but escaped with his life. But just as others before him, his machine never fully caught on, and he died in poverty. In 1832, an American mechanic and inventor named Walter Hunt devised a working sewing machine, but concerned with the welfare and success of seamstresses and tailors, decided against filing the patent. Hunt did, however, go on to patent the safety pen, the fountain pen, a streetcar bell, a coal-fired stove, an ice boat, an ice plow, a street sweeping machine, and an early repeating rifle design. But it wasn't until 1844 that all these elements came together to create a truly practical machine, and that came from Englishman John Fisher, who in 1844 patented a machine for making lace that was very much like one that was created by Isaac Singer in 1851. Importantly, though, while Fisher's device earned a patent, that patent was apparently either lost or misfiled by the Patent Office. Next was Elias Howe, Jr. in Massachusetts. He had been an apprentice in a textile factory and later in the shop of a master mechanic, where he latched onto the concept of making a sewing machine. In 1846, his machine was the first to be patented with a lock-stitch design and a needle with an eye at the point, powered by a hand crank. Howe spent a great deal of money on improvements and marketing, but after failing to find investors in the United States, his brother marketed the machine in London. There, William Thomas, a factory owner, purchased one for £250. Howe then traveled to London to further design in conjunction with Thomas, but after business disagreements and the failing health of his wife, returned to the United States. He was penniless, not even able to afford the steerage to get home. On board the ship, he served as cook to earn his way and became soon afterwards a widower. It was learned that the sewing machine had proliferated with various patents for minor differences, but he was unable to afford the court cases in defense of his own patent. Shortly after the death of Howe's wife, an American inventor named Isaac Singer was working in a machine shop in Boston where sewing machines designed by a pair named Blodgett and Leroux were being repaired. The shop owner asked Singer if he could improve the machine because it was cumbersome to make and utilize. Singer's improvements, a straight needle instead of a curved one and a linear shuttle instead of a circular one, were memorialized in his patent number 8294 in August of 1851. But it was about this time that Howe started borrowing money from friends and family in order to pursue court cases against all the companies that were manufacturing machines in violation of his patent, including Singer. Singer tried to argue that Howe's design was not original because Walter Hunt had invented the machine previous to that, but since Hunt had never filed for his patent, Howe won the dispute and earned the right to have royalties on all lock-stitch machines that used eye-pointed needles. Originally, the royalties were $25 per machine. And with the sewing machine adapting and improving so rapidly, many other patent holders pursued legal cases in what has often been called the sewing machine war. In October of 1856, the president of one sewing machine company, Grover and Baker, proposed a sort of legal truce. He worked with several manufacturers, including Singer, Wheeler and Wilson, and Elias Howe, to form the Sewing Machine Combination, or Sewing Machine Trust. The group pooled their patents and agreed to share the profits, with Howe getting a reduced royalty of $5 per machine sold in the United States and $1 for every machine sold abroad. This agreement allowed manufacturers to concentrate on production and sales, not legal action. It ended in 1877, when the last patent expired. Because Howe was paid per machine, his royalty records allow us to know just how quickly sewing machine production grew. In 1853, Wheeler and Wilson produced just shy of 800 machines. By 1859, the number was 21,000, with the total for the 7 years being almost 34,000 sewing machines. Singer produced slightly more than 800 machines in 1853, and about 11,000 in 1859, with a 7-year total of over 23,000. In 1860, 110,000 machines were made in the United States. In 1860, the New York Times chimed, "Such are some of the important results accomplished by the sewing machines, these Lilliputian needle women that never become weary while performing the labor of human fingers. Every day extends their use into remoter parts of the country and of the world. They are used in China, in Hindustan, Australia, Turkey, Africa, South America, and throughout Europe. In fact, everywhere that busy needle is plied, these tireless workers have found their way, carrying relief for women's trembling hands and weary eyes. The swift-flying needle, the best boon to a woman in the 19th century, has already won many victories, and soon the song of the shirt will be heard only in tradition of sufferings passed away." But in all this growth, one company stood out and is still a household name today. Singer, despite having to pay royalties, built a flourishing business. He invested in mass production with interchangeable parts, making his machines less expensive to produce, and introduced a smaller machine intended for home use. Edward Clark, Singer's attorney and part owner of the company, launched the concept of installation payments, or hire purchase plans. This allowed the machine to be used for income while still paying off the purchase. According to one article, Singer said, "I don't care a damn for the invention. The dimes are what I'm after." And he made many dimes. At the time of his death in 1875, his company was one of the first American-based companies to be multinational and was profiting some $22 million a year. According to American Science and Invention, Singer was the first to spend more than $1 million on advertising. The company's website currently claims that it produced the first practical sewing machine and that by 1890, the company had 90% of the global market share. Isaac Singer and Elias Howe both died multimillionaires, and the sewing machine went on to impact society in other ways. Firstly, the industrialized garment industry allowed for cheaper clothing, allowing the purchase of new clothing instead of repairing worn ones. This freed up time otherwise spent creating or maintaining a family's clothing. Prior to sewing machines, the amount of time it took an experienced seamstress to create a gentleman's dress shirt by hand was 14 hours. A frock coat would take 10, and a pair of pantaloons took 5. With a sewing machine, the time was drastically reduced to between 1 and 3 hours per item. The change allowed women to seek employment outside the home. The machine also transformed industry. More clothing could be produced more cheaply, and the increased income for more workers increased demand. The garment industry grew, along with ancillary industries like growing cotton, manufacturing machines and parts, and department stores to sell the products. With the new industry, however, came new challenges of industrialization. Ready-to-wear clothing did not require specialized craftsmen, and textile industry needed a huge quantity of employees in factories. With the sewing machine and the use of assembly line techniques, unskilled labor could be utilized by textile companies to make clothing even less expensive, although oftentimes creating unsafe working conditions for underpaid workers. The most well-known of these instances was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Manhattan, New York. On Saturday, March 25, 1911, a fire started on the 8th floor of the Ash Building where the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory manufactured women's blouses on the top 3 floors of the 10-story building. The 8th and 10th floors had telephone connection and were alerted to the fire, but the 9th did not. Adding insult to injury, the exits were locked to prevent employees from sneaking breaks or stealing clothing. The managers could check purses since all employees exited through one set of doors. And with the fire blocking the only open stairwell, many resorted to jumping from the windows to escape the flames. The death toll in the day was 146 garment workers, only 23 of whom were men. The tragedy of that day led to many legislative reforms and creation of new organizations. The American Society of Safety Professionals was formed to help create industry standards for occupational safety and health. New York State Legislature formed the Factory Investigating Commission to prevent hazards and loss of life. Their investigations led to the creation of 38 new labor laws in New York. The impact of the invention of the sewing machine was truly profound. It changed economies, it changed industries, it changed women's roles in industry, it changed the way that we regulate industry, but it also powerfully impacted culture. Things like department stores and advertising and consumer culture were powerfully impacted by sewing machines, which were among the first industrialized items to be marketed directly towards women. The introduction of electric sewing machines, which were first available in 1889 but became much more available after the First World War, was part of what spurred the demand to have electricity in homes. With factories spewing out clothing, fashions changed much more quickly, and clothing didn't have to last as long, and new stores were created or stores were transformed. Entire industries were transformed in order to showcase those fashions. In other industries, like interior design, think about things like drapes or furniture, or the interior of automobiles were also revolutionized by the invention. According to Time magazine, Mahatma Gandhi, who was a man famous for simplicity, said that the sewing machine is one of the few useful things ever to have been invented. I'll see from the start here, I'm not the most handy guy. I know which end of the hammer to hit with, but I'm not much more use around the house than that. But even I own quite a lot of these screwdrivers here. I mean, after all, it's one of the most common tools in the world. Half your house is put together with screws, and you got to hang up your hat somehow, right? I would venture to guess that virtually everybody that watches this owns at least one screwdriver. But the funny thing is that if you are a viewer in Canada, you are very likely to own a type of screwdriver that viewers outside of Canada are very likely to have never seen or even heard of in their life. And the reason that Canada has its own kind of screwdriver has to do with a really unique point in history where a group of technologies came together to drive a whole bunch of innovation, but that innovation was impacted by powerful world events at the time. Things like the Russian Revolution and the First and Second World Wars and the powerful personality of Henry Ford. The great debate between the Robertson and the Phillips head screwdriver is history that deserves to be remembered. The idea of the screw, that is an inclined plane that spirals around a central shaft, is ancient. The earliest known uses were a water pump that might have been invented in Syria to irrigate the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, in the first millennium BC. The device was in use in Egypt at least by the 3rd century BC, when the Greek mathematician and engineer Archimedes of Syracuse saw and described one. The device was later incorrectly attributed to Archimedes and is commonly called the Archimedes screw. Screws were also used, at least since the Hellenistic period, to drive presses for, say, pressing olive oil or pressing grapes for wine. But screws were not used as fasteners like we use them today. Without industrial methods, they simply would have been far too expensive to make. A number of other methods, including dovetails and dowels, were used in fastening, as well as, of course, the much more easily produced nail. Screws as fasteners were not apparently produced until around the 15th century. The earliest known mention is in a late 15th century manuscript. Their initial use was as a fastener for parts of medieval jousting armor and, in nearly the same period, for early firearms. The wheel lock uses an internal spring to drive a piece of iron against a piece of pyrite to produce a spark to light the powder. The pyrite wore out quickly and so had to be replaced often, and a screw was thus used, since it could easily be screwed in and out. The earliest screwdrivers were built to service these weapons, and they were called either a screw turner or a turn screw, and they had a pear-shaped wooden handle, and otherwise looked a lot like a modern flat-headed screwdriver. But these screws and screwdrivers would have been custom-made and used on very expensive devices like wheel locks and jousting armor, and so screws were not for the common folk. In 1760, brothers Job and William Wyatt of Staffordshire patented a screw-making machine that used a file to cut in the threads following the pitch of a lead screw. This allowed mass production of screws and was a precursor to industrial mass production machines. The idea of using a lathe of some sort to cut threads was variously improved upon until a process for cold rolling threads was perfected in the 1880s. But virtually all of these screws used just a few turning methods, either a hexagon or square that was turned externally, or a flat slot cut to turn internally. And as anyone who has ever used one knows, flat-headed screws and screwdrivers have their problems. There were many alternatives proposed and even patented in the latter half of the 19th century, but most were not easily manufactured, and slotted screws still prevailed. But solutions were on the horizon. Peter L. Robertson was born in Haldimand County, Ontario, Canada in 1879. A tinkerer, Robertson produced a number of inventions, including a new design for cufflinks and even a better mousetrap. In 1905, he received a patent in Canada for a new design of a corkscrew that centered itself on the bottle. Around the turn of the century, Robertson was working through eastern Canada as what was called a high-pitch man, meaning a traveling salesman for a Philadelphia tool company. High-pitch men would sell their wares, say, on a street corner at a county fair, calling out their wares. And among the things that he was selling was a device of his own design. Robert's 20th century wrench brace was a multi-tool that could be used as a monkey wrench, as a brace, as a bench vise, as a screwdriver, and as a rivet maker. And he called it the greatest tool on earth. And if all that sounds impressive, there were actually several multi-tools that were very similar, patented in that era. But it was in demonstrating another tool, a spring-loaded screwdriver, that gave Robertson his most famous idea. While demonstrating the screwdriver, which was flat-bladed, the blade slipped and seriously cut his hand. That gave him the idea of a new type of screwdriver head that was less likely to slip or cam out. This is not a new concept. There was a great variety of new screw-head designs patented in the latter half of the 19th century, but most never went anywhere, largely because of difficulties in manufacturing, but also because virtually everyone already owned a flat-headed screwdriver. In fact, the basis of Robertson's idea, a square-headed screw and driver, was not new. In 1875, Allen Cummings of New York City had been granted a patent for a screw that used a cavity, either a square or triangle, rather than a slot, to address the same problem. Cummings' description noted, "It is well known that the ordinary screw head provided with a slot is very susceptible to injury, caused mainly by the slipping of the screwdriver from the slot when the screw is being set home in wood or metal. By omitting the usual slot and using the proper shaped cavity and screwdriver, perfect safety is ensured to the metallic cap." But Cummings' design had a flaw. The way that you made the cavity that the screwdriver fit into was by stamping it with a die, and stamping it deeply enough that the screwdriver would set inside it would deform or weaken the screw head. Robertson had a better solution, for which he applied for a patent in 1907. His screw tapered the sides of the square gradually down to a pyramid shape. This not only prevented the head from being deformed, but actually helped align the metal grain, as he explained, knitting the atoms together for greater strength. It had the added advantage of less waste, since the slot of a slot-headed screw was usually cut out, losing a bit of metal and weakening the head of the screw. Because it was less likely to cam out, you could use more torque with the Robertson screw and driver. As it was self-centering, it could be used with one hand, whereas a slotted screwdriver usually required two. The head of the screw was less likely to deform, and the Robertson screwdriver was much better able to still remove the screw if it did. It also worked better than a slotted screw if the screw had been painted over. Robertson's screw and driver were particularly attractive to furniture makers and boat builders, where it was more of a problem if a flathead screw cammed out because it would damage the material around it, damage the value of the product. But perhaps best of all is that Robertson's screw could be cold formed. That is, because the stamp tapered down inside the screw, that meant that you could build the screw without ever having to heat the metal. Cummings' design, as ingenious as it was, probably was never made during its patent life because the screw simply couldn't be easily manufactured. But Robertson's design could be cheaply manufactured, in the millions. Calling his invention the biggest little invention of the 20th century so far, Robertson gained enough investors to open the P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company Limited in 1908. He built a factory in Milton, Ontario, which gave him tax breaks and a $10,000 loan. The patent was approved February 1909, and by then the company was already filling orders. Robertson was just 30 years old. While the Robertson Company described the initial years as hard, with local competitors even challenging their patent, the Robertson screw slowly gained adherents among boat builders and furniture makers. In 1913, Fisher Auto Body opened a factory in Walkerville, Ontario, making wooden parts for the Ford Model T. The Robertson screw offered a great advantage for manufacturing, and Fisher became one of Robertson's largest customers, using some 700 screws per body. Robertson later designed a screw for metal to use on the all-metal body of the Ford Model A. Having been awarded international patents, Robertson saw the opportunity to expand abroad, and so he went to Gillingham, England, and established a company called the Recess Screw Company. He marketed to British industry using the slogan, "The screw that grips the driver." But his real plan was to manufacture screws in England, but sell them in Germany and Russia, and the First World War and the Russian Revolution foiled his plan. Recess screws turned to war production during the Great War and produced things like firing needles and hand grenade pins, but after the war, recess screws failed. There seems to have been several factors involved, including a glut of supply following the war and the actions of some unscrupulous investors, but Robertson resigned as the director of the company. But the company in Canada was still doing well, and Robertson looked to expand into the United States. He attempted to negotiate a deal with a manufacturer in Buffalo, New York, but the company wanted a say in manufacturing decisions. And Robertson, perhaps stung by his experience in England, refused to give up that control. Then Henry Ford came to the table. An analysis had shown that the use of Robertson screws in the Ford plants in Canada had saved $2.60 a car, a significant savings for a car that retailed for only $390 and which was being produced in the millions. Ford wanted to use Robertson screws in all his U.S. plants. But Ford wanted to say in production and an exclusive contract, and Robertson stubbornly refused to give up that control. When the deal fell through, Robertson not only did not get the contract for the American Ford plants, but lost the contracts in Canada, almost a third of his business. After 3 failed tries, Robertson decided to never try to license his screws outside of Canada again, but his marketing skills made his screws and drivers the screwdrivers of choice in Canada, even though just across the border of the United States, they're hardly known at all. But Ford was still using flat screws, which were even more troublesome on automated assembly lines, where if a screw cammed out, it cost time and slowed manufacturing. The solution started with a patent application in 1932 by John P. Thompson, an auto mechanic living in Portland, Oregon. Thompson's new screw design used a cruciform. Like the square-headed screw, this was not a new idea, but again, similarly, previous patents for screws using cruciform heads, as he explained in the application, push the metal ahead of the tool and so disturbs the distribution of the metal as to render the screw head extremely fragile. Thompson's solution was similar to Robertson's. By tapering the screw head, a star die could be used without distorting the metal, and again, stamping the tapered design made the metal actually stronger. Moreover, by tapering the screw, a driver could be used even if it was not the exact right size, and again, the new cruciform-headed screw would engage with the driver, making it less likely to cam out than a flathead screw. In 1933, when the patent was granted, Thomson assigned it to Henry Frank Phillips. Like Robertson, Henry Phillips had been a traveling salesman. By the time the patent was assigned to him, he was the managing director of a mining concern, the Oregon Copper Company. It's not really clear why Thomson assigned the patent to Phillips. It might be that Thomson simply couldn't figure out how to sell it or couldn't find investors, but it also might be that he already had an agreement with Phillips when the patent was filed. But Phillips refined the design and was granted more patents. Unlike Robertson, Phillips did not intend to manufacture screws, but hoped to license the patents to manufacture and collect royalties. Not surprisingly, with new invention, Phillips got a lot of rejections from companies who told him the idea lacked promise for commercial success. But eventually Phillips convinced Eugene E. Clark of the American Screw Company of Providence, Rhode Island, to manufacture the design. By 1934, the screw was available for consumers. While the tendency to cam out could be troublesome for anyone driving screws, it was a particular problem for manufacturing, which even at that time was using power tools. Phillips' later patents application seemed to have recognized the advantage. A 1934 application said, "Failure of the slotted screw to retain the blade driver, especially in power-driven operations, is not only dangerous to the operator, but is likewise always injurious to the work." It was clear what market he saw for his design. In 1936, General Motors was invited to test the design. The Phillips head screw first went into use at GM, making the 1936 Cadillac. The advantages for industries large and small was obvious. Customers raved about the amount of work time saved. Within just a few years, virtually all U.S. automakers, including Ford, were using Phillips head screws. The airplane manufacturing and railroad industry likewise switched. By 1939, 20 companies had licenses to produce Phillips head screws. By 1940, 85% of U.S. screw manufacturers had a license for the design, and the company grossed more than $1.3 million adjusted dollars. While the Second World War limited foreign licenses, it established the Phillips head screw as an industry standard among wartime manufacturers. The hundreds of thousands of planes and motor vehicles built by the U.S. during the war were largely screwed together using Phillips head screws. By the time Phillips patents expired in the 1960s, there were more than 160 domestic licensees, and half again that number of foreign licenses. While Robertson had Canada, Phillips screws are, by industry estimates, by far the most popular type of screw everywhere else in the world. There's still a heated debate over which is better, the Robertson screwdriver or the Phillips-headed screwdriver, and that debate has only grown more heated recently as the internet and fair trade makes it easier to acquire Robertson screws and drivers outside of Canada. In general, the Robertson screwdriver does grip the screw better, and that means that you don't have to use as much pressure to be able to turn the screw without it camming out, and it's less likely to strip the screw, which are both issues that bedevil common users of Phillips-headed screwdrivers. But that ability to cam out actually offers an advantage for manufacturing. With a Phillips-headed screw, when the machine has set the screw, it will cam out, and that keeps it from overdriving the screw. And as an advantage at home, in a pinch, you can use a flat-headed screwdriver to spin a Phillips-headed screw, and you can't do that with the Robertson screw. So far, the Phillips head remains supreme pretty much everywhere but Canada, but the Robertson screwdriver has made significant inroads, especially among furniture and boat makers. And the discussion has become more convoluted as there are now many more alternatives on the market, some of which are compatible with existing drivers. Its patents for the Phillips head long expired. The Phillips Screw Company today develops and licenses some of those new types of screws and drivers. The Phillips-headed screw was so successful that it might have been too successful. In 1947, the federal government funded charges against Phillips and several manufacturers claiming that they had engaged in anti-competitive practices, including price fixing and suppressing competition. The eventual resolution in 1948 was a consent decree that reduced Phillips' ability to enforce its patents. The Robertson and Phillips screws were the culmination of the development of screw technology over a couple of hundred years, and they were two types that rose to the top in an era where there was a lot of innovation in the field. It's really ironic that the events of the First World War were part of the reason that the Robertson screw was never developed internationally, whereas events of the Second World War were the reason that the Phillips-headed screw was. And the relative fates between the two say that invention isn't about just the inspiration and, pun intended, drive of the inventor, but of a complex interaction with historical forces and powerful personalities. Things that can impact every tool in the toolbox. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.